gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Valeomavaega, recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to extend and revise my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I take this special order to address a most serious problem pertaining to the colony of West Papua New Guinea, as it is noted and made part of the Foreign Relations Act for fiscal years 2005, 2006, and 2007. Mr. Speaker, the House has just passed this important legislation by a historic vote of 351 to 78 in favor of this bill. And I certainly want to personally commend the Honorable Chairman of our International Relations Committee, Mr. Hyde, our Senior Ranking Member, Mr. Lantos from California, and the distinguished Chairman of our Subcommittee on Asia Pacific, Mr. Jim Leach from Iowa, and my colleague, Congressman Don Payne from the state of New Jersey, for their tremendous help and leadership in getting this provision included in this year's authorization bill. At the outset, Mr. Speaker, I want to first extend my congratulations, and I do commend the good people of Indonesia for having achieved this new milestone of their political development into a democratic form of government. I commend the newly elected President of Indonesia, President Yudhoyono, and I wish him well in all his efforts to fight corruption and bring about democratic reforms in the new government. I also know, Mr. Speaker, with interest that the Honorable Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. John Howard, is visiting us here in Washington. It is my sincere hope that the Prime Minister will seriously rethink again Australia's policy towards the West Papua New Guinea. And I urge all the Pacific nations of the Forum Organization not to turn their backs on West Papua New Guinea. As former colonies themselves, the Forum nations should seriously take the matter of West Papua New Guinea before the United Nations for re-examination, especially of the faulty policies that were implemented by the United Nations towards West Papua New Guinea in the years past. Mr. Speaker, history has not been kind neither to the people of Indonesia nor to the people of West Papua New Guinea. Under the military dictatorships of Presidents Sukarno and Suharto, some 1 million Indonesians were brutally murdered and killed, similar to the killing fields in Cambodia under Pol Pot. And by the same token, since the military takeover of West Papua by the Indonesian Army in 1969, approximately 100,000 West Papuans were murdered, tortured, killed, and it continues even as I speak today, Mr. Speaker. In actual fact, Mr. Speaker, according to human rights reports and West Papuans themselves, actually, approximately 300,000 to 400,000 West Papuans have been murdered, tortured to death, and disappeared by the hands of the Indonesian military. Mr. Speaker, the United States mediated an agreement in 1962 between the Dutch and Indonesia regarding West Papua, but totally without Papuan representation. Under the terms of the agreement, the Dutch were to leave West Papua and transfer sovereignty to the United Nations Temporary Executive Authority for a period of 6 years, after which time a national referendum would be held to determine West Papua's political status. This shift, however, did not come to pass. In fact, shortly after the sealing of this agreement, Indonesia violated in unambiguous terms by military force of arms under President Sukarno, seized control of West Papua from the United Nations. And therefore, thereafter in 1969, Indonesia orchestrated an election that many regard as a brutal military operation. Known as an act of free choice, 1,022 Papuan elders were selected under heavy military harassment and intimidation of their families, and to no one's surprise, Mr. Speaker, every elder voted in favor of Indonesian rule. Under the ensuing decades of Indonesian military rule, West Papuans have suffered as victims of one of the most repressive and unjust systems of colonial occupation in the 20th century. Brutal treatment by the Indonesian military has resulted in the deaths, as I said earlier, some 100,000 West Papuans. I am delighted to say that this bill requires Secretary Rice and the Department of State to re-examine the special autonomy law that was supposed to give autonomy to West Papua. It's my understanding, Mr. Speaker, that the provisions of the autonomy law that was passed by the Indonesian military parliament, while substantive, is nothing but the paper that was written on. The autonomy law, Mr. Speaker, I respectfully submit, is nothing but a sham, a complete farce. and the Indonesian government should be ashamed for doing this. Mr. Speaker, President Bush, during his speech and his inauguration and his presentation in February of this year before the joint session of Congress, I believe gave one of the best speeches that I've ever heard concerning democracy and the need as a commitment from our nation to promote democracy throughout throughout the world, among the countries of the world. And since the passage of the Special Autonomy Law 3 years ago, 4 key measures under the law remain unimplemented or actively violated. The Papuan People's Council remain non-existent, cheating indigenous West Papuans of the right to representation. The funds for West Papua are neither unallocated or are allocated late, threatening their ability to meet their basic human needs. Transmigration continues, overwhelming cultural distinctions, indigenous West Papuans with Indonesian migrants, and key governance provisions were violated when West Papua was divided now into 2 provinces. We cannot allow the repeat of history, Mr. Speaker. Rather, we must work to ensure that the central government acts in concert with the needs of the indigenous people of West Papua. Mr. Speaker, human rights abuses committed by the Indonesian military over decades, including those related to environmental degradation, still continues today. Under the repressive regimes of Presidents Sukarno and Suharto, military brutality continued. The Indonesian military and special forces have in the past 3 years alone murdered 81 indigenous Papuans, tortured, beaten, and jailed 34 more Papuans, displaced some 6,393 families from their homes, burnt down 23 churches, 370 traditional houses. This violation threatens to escalate. Indonesian central government is responding swiftly to a West Papuan announcement that decisively rejects the Special Autonomy Law. And as I speak, Mr. Speaker, the Indonesian army or the government is currently transferring over 15,000 troops to West Papua, which is already occupied by some 10,000 troops composed of 6 Army battalions, 1 Air Force battalion, 1 battalion of mobile brigade police, and which totals some 25,000 soldiers, by far the heaviest military presence in all of Indonesia. Mr. Speaker, these human rights issues transcend national borders. It is time that Congress will no longer tolerate the human rights abuses threatening the military violence and the denial of a voice under the people of West Papua have suffered for so many years. Mr. Speaker, for too long, the cries of the West Papuans have fallen on deaf ears, and I pray that with the concerted attention of the Congress, international community will support this effort. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mrs. Captor from Ohio.